Two teenage boys went out for a simple night of hunting and never came home. Hours later, their bodies were found lying across railroad tracks. Their deaths ruled an accident, but the truth was far darker. Autopsies were falsified. Witnesses began to die. A prosecutor who promised justice turned out to be corrupt. And for decades, a mother fought against a system determined to bury the truth. This is not just the story of Kevin Ives and Don Henry. This is the story of power, corruption, and America's most haunting unsolved mystery. The Boys on the Tracks. It was the summer of 1987 in central Arkansas. Hot, humid nights hung heavy over the small town of Alexander, where life moved slowly. Neighbors waved to each other, and everyone seemed to know everyone's name. But on the night of August 22nd, that sense of calm was shattered forever. That evening, two boys, Kevin Ives, 17, and Don Henry, 16, decided to spend the night like many small-town kids did. Kevin was the quieter one, a good student, known for his love of football and his easy smile. His parents described him as responsible and trustworthy. Don was a little more outgoing, adventurous, with a sharp sense of humor that often got him in trouble, but nothing serious. Just a regular teenager who loved the outdoors and hanging out with friends. The two were inseparable. Childhood friends who hunted, fished, and played sports together. That night, they planned something simple. Go out, do a little hunting in the woods near the railroad tracks, then head home. It was supposed to be just another summer night. Around 4 a.m., a cargo train hauling nearly 6,000 tons of goods was making its way through the area. The engineer, out of habit, kept his eyes fixed on the tracks ahead, but as the train curved around a bend, he froze. Up ahead on the darkened tracks were two human figures lying motionless, side by side. It was Kevin and Don. The engineer did everything he could. He blasted the horn repeatedly. He slammed the emergency brakes. But with that much weight and momentum, there was no stopping the train in time. The train plowed forward, and in an instant, the boys' bodies were struck and mangled beneath the steel wheels. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the crew rushed out in shock and horror. The boys hadn't moved at all. It was as if they hadn't even heard the horn. When authorities arrived, they took in the strange sight. Kevin and Don's rifles lay nearby. Their bodies were lying parallel on the tracks, almost perfectly positioned. The initial theory? The boys had smoked marijuana, passed out, and tragically fallen asleep on the tracks. It was, to many, the easy explanation. But Kevin's parents and Don's parents rejected it instantly. They knew their sons. They knew these boys wouldn't just collapse on the tracks. Something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. When Kevin's mother was told her son was dead, she screamed, "No, not Kevin, you're wrong." Don's family collapsed in disbelief, unable to imagine their adventurous son ending this way. The whole community was shaken. Two good boys, gone in an instant, and yet, in the weeks that followed, the tragedy began to twist into something even darker. Because as investigators dug deeper, they began to find evidence that suggested Kevin and Don hadn't simply fallen asleep. They may have seen something that night, something they were never meant to see, and someone wanted them silenced. What really happened on those tracks? Why were two healthy teenage boys lying side by side, motionless, in the path of a freight train? And who stood to gain from their deaths? The story was only just beginning. The morning after Kevin and Don were killed by the train, shock turned to questions. Two healthy teenage boys, lying side by side on the tracks in the dead of night. It didn't make sense, but when the autopsy results came back, the questions only deepened. The state medical examiner, Dr. Fahmi Malak, ruled the deaths an accident. According to him, the boys had smoked 20 marijuana cigarettes, an enormous, almost impossible amount, and had passed out in a marijuana-induced stupor right on the tracks. That was his official explanation. Case closed. But for the families, and for many in the community, the ruling was outrageous. 20 joints? Passed out perfectly side by side? Not waking up to a blaring train horn? None of it made sense. Kevin's mother, Linda Ives, was furious. She had raised her son better. She knew he experimented with marijuana like many teens, but 20 joints? She said flatly, "That's a lie. My son didn't die that way." Don's father, Curtis Henry, was equally enraged. He had seen his son hours before. Don was alert, clear-eyed, and excited about the night ahead. Both families knew the accident theory was wrong. But if it wasn't an accident, then what was it? As neighbors gossiped and locals shared theories, one thing became clear. People didn't trust the ruling. Dr. Malak, the medical examiner, already had a reputation. His office had produced questionable autopsy results before. Some said he bent under political pressure. So the families demanded a second autopsy. And that's when the story began to unravel. The boys' bodies were exhumed, and independent pathologists conducted a new examination. What they found was chilling. Kevin's skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, as if he had been struck before the train ever arrived. Don had deep stab wounds in his back. The new conclusion? The boys had been attacked, beaten, and stabbed before they were laid across the railroad tracks. The train hadn't killed them. It had merely destroyed the evidence of a brutal crime. The second autopsy turned the case upside down. Kevin and Don were no longer tragic victims of drug use and bad luck. They were murder victims, and their killers were still out there. For Linda, Ives, and Curtis Henry, the pain of losing their sons had now transformed into a mission. It wasn't enough to grieve. It wasn't enough to bury their children. They had to fight. They had to push for answers, because someone had killed Kevin and Don. And the system was already trying to cover it up. Why would two teenage boys be murdered? What did they see that night near the tracks? And why were powerful people already working so hard to silence the truth? The answers would drag the families into a world of corruption, drugs, and conspiracy that reached far beyond the quiet town of Alexander, Arkansas. The case of the boys on the tracks was only getting darker. With the second autopsy thing became undeniable. Kevin, Ives, and Don Henry had not died in an accident. They had been murdered. But the question lingered. Why? Two teenage boys, no enemies, no history of crime. Who would want them dead? The answer, investigators would soon learn, pointed to something far larger, darker, and more dangerous than anyone expected. Soon after the murders, rumors began to spread through Saline County. Locals whispered that the railroad tracks where the boys had been found were not just for trains. That stretch of land, people said, was a drop zone where low-flying planes trafficked drugs into Arkansas, dumping packages near the tracks to be picked up later. Could Kevin and Don have stumbled onto one of these drops that night? Had they seen something they weren't supposed to see? Several witnesses later came forward with chilling stories. One man claimed he saw a low-flying plane the night of the murders, circling near the tracks. Another said he spotted suspicious men carrying large bundles in the woods, as if retrieving something. Others claimed they had heard gunshots not long before the train struck the boys. If true, it meant Kevin and Don hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been silenced because they had seen something criminal. But here's where things became even stranger. Every time new witnesses came forward, their statements seemed to go nowhere. Police reports vanished. Evidence was lost. Leads weren't followed. It was as if someone didn't want the truth to come out. And when the families pushed harder, they were met with resistance, even hostility. It became clear this wasn't just a local crime. It was a crime tangled up with corruption and politics. By the late 1980s, Arkansas had become a hub for drug trafficking routes. Planes dropped cocaine shipments in remote areas. Local officials looked the other way. Some even profited. And as the families dug deeper, they began to suspect that Kevin and Don's murders weren't just random violence. They were a message, a warning, a reminder of how far some would go to protect their secrets. Linda, Ives and Curtis Henry began receiving anonymous phone calls. Some urged them to stop asking questions. Others hinted at threats, but Linda refused to be intimidated. She would later say, "If they think they can scare me, they don't know me. I'll never stop fighting for Kevin." Still, the danger was real. Even people who tried to help local witnesses, small-time investigators, sometimes ended up dead themselves. The case was no longer just about two boys. It was about a system of corruption and silence. What exactly did Kevin and Don stumble upon that August night? Was it a simple drug drop gone wrong? Or was their murder connected to something even bigger? A political cover-up reaching all the way to the top of Arkansas's power? The answers would shake the state and expose a conspiracy darker than anyone imagined. By now, it was clear Kevin, Ives and Don Henry had not died by accident. They had been murdered. And every clue pointed to a dark secret hiding in plain sight. But what made the case so much more terrifying was not just the crime itself. It was how every attempt to uncover the truth was met with walls of silence, missing evidence, and intimidation. The families were not just fighting for justice. They were fighting against a system designed to protect itself. It all began with Dr. Fahmy Malak, the Arkansas state medical examiner who had insisted Kevin and Don had smoked 20 marijuana cigarettes and simply passed out. His ruling was bizarre, ridiculous even. But Malak was protected. Governor Bill Clinton and other state officials defended him repeatedly, despite growing criticism. Why? Because Malak had a history of making rulings that conveniently supported the interests of powerful people. He was not just a medical examiner. He was a tool, someone who could make inconvenient deaths go away. When a grand jury was convened to look into Kevin and Don's deaths, families hoped for justice, but instead they got stonewalled. Witnesses were ignored. Key evidence, like Don's stabbed shirt, disappeared. The jury eventually declared the deaths probable homicide. But beyond that, nothing happened. It was justice in name only. The whispers around town grew louder. People said the tracks were used as a drug drop site, that local law enforcement looked the other way, that politicians were connected to the money flowing in from cocaine shipments. And that Kevin and Don had stumbled onto this hidden network. If true, then their murders weren't just about silencing two boys. They were about silencing anyone who dared to threaten the pipeline, investigators who weren't afraid to dig deeper, began to uncover disturbing connections. Planes flying low at night, packages being retrieved near the tracks. Names of local lawmen, even politicians, whispered as being in on it. And at the heart of it all, Dan Harmon, a local prosecutor who presented himself as a champion for the boys' families. At first, Linda Ives trusted him. He seemed determined to help, but over time, rumors emerged that Harmon himself had deep ties to the drug trade and was using his position not to expose the truth, but to bury it. For Kevin and Don's families, it felt like they were screaming into the wind. Everywhere they turned, doors slammed shut. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted or went missing. Even sympathetic investigators were suddenly reassigned. Linda Ives later said, "We thought we were fighting for justice, but soon we realized we were fighting the very people who were supposed to deliver it." In Alexander, people stopped talking about the case openly. Too many strange things were happening. Too many people who knew something ended up silenced by intimidation. Or worse. The message was clear: stay quiet. But Kevin and Don's parents refused, even if it meant taking on the most powerful forces in their state. They were not backing down. How deep did the corruption go? Were local officials, police, even prosecutors complicit in protecting drug traffickers? And could two grieving families possibly take on an entire system designed to cover its own tracks? The case of the boys on the tracks was no longer just about two teenagers. It was about exposing a hidden empire built on drugs, power, and silence. By now, it was clear Kevin and Don's murders were not random. They had seen something, and powerful people wanted it buried forever. But what made the case truly chilling wasn't just the corruption. It was what began happening to the people who tried to tell the truth. Over the months and years following Kevin and Don's deaths, witness after witness connected to the case died under strange or violent circumstances. Some were ruled accidents, some suicides, some murders with no suspects. But taken together, the pattern was undeniable. Anyone who might have known the truth about that night was being erased. One man, Greg Collins, was set to testify before a grand jury, but before he could speak, Greg was found dead, shot in the head. Authorities ruled it suicide. But his family insisted Greg was no killer of himself. Another voice silenced. Another witness, Keith McCaskill, had told friends he feared for his life. He had seen things, and he knew the drug trade ran deep. He even confided to friends, "If anything happens to me, look to this case." Days later, Keith was found stabbed more than 100 times. His body stuffed into the trunk of his own car. Police called it a random act of violence. But the family saw it for what it was: murder. To keep him quiet, it didn't stop there. Another man connected to the case was found shot in the head. His death ruled suicide, despite 2 bullet wounds. Yet another witness died in a car accident under circumstances that looked anything but accidental. One by one, people who knew something were taken out of the picture. The list of the dead grew so long that locals began whispering, "If you talk about the boys on the tracks, you don't live long." In Alexander and across Saline County, people were terrified. Neighbors avoided discussing the case, even behind closed doors. Parents told their children, "Don't ever bring up Kevin and Don. Just let it go." But Linda Ives and Curtis Henry refused to let it go. Every death, every silenced witness only fueled their determination. They began keeping their own lists, documenting every suspicious death, It was the only way to show the world the pattern. Despite the growing body count, authorities continued to shrug. Each death was explained away. Each lead conveniently collapsed. The families were left to wonder, were the killers of Kevin and Don also eliminating the witnesses? Or was it something even bigger? A coordinated effort by people in power to ensure the truth never saw daylight. Through it all, Kevin and Don's families lived a nightmare. It wasn't enough to lose their sons. Now, they had to watch as everyone who might bring answers was destroyed. Still, they pressed on. Linda Ives once said, "They can kill every witness. They can bury every piece of evidence. But I will never stop saying my son was murdered. And I will never stop demanding the truth." How many witnesses would have to die before someone in power admitted the truth? Why were young men and women being picked off one by one? And most haunting of all, who was pulling the strings behind this web of silence, fear, and blood? The Boys on the Tracks case was no longer just a local mystery. It was a story of murder, conspiracy, and a chilling pattern of silenced voices. And the darkest revelations were still to come. When Kevin and Don were first killed, their families felt helpless that the police didn't listen. The medical examiner had failed them. The system seemed stacked against them. And then came a man who promised to fight for justice. His name was Dan Harmon. Harmon was a young, ambitious prosecutor in Saline County. He spoke with passion. He looked the families in the eye and told them, "I'll find out what happened to your boys. I'll fight for them." For Linda Ives and Curtis Henry, it was a lifeline. Here, finally, was someone inside the system who seemed to care. Someone who wasn't afraid to take on the corruption. Harmon pushed for investigations. He stood beside the families in front of cameras. He presented himself as their champion. For a moment, hope flickered. But behind the scenes, things were not as they seemed. Whispers spread that Harmon had his own connections to the drug trade, that his fiery speeches were more performance than truth, that the man who claimed to be fighting corruption might actually be protecting it. As time went on, evidence began to suggest Harmon wasn't just failing the families, he was betraying them. Investigators began to uncover alarming details. Harmon was accused of working with the very networks that trafficked drugs through Arkansas. The same networks the boys may have stumbled upon that night. It was a stunning betrayal. Here was the man who had stood at vigils, spoken on television about justice. And yet, behind closed doors, he was allegedly profiting from the same machine that had cost Kevin and Don their lives. Eventually, Harmon's double life came crashing down. In the 1990s, he was indicted on federal charges, including drug distribution, racketeering, and extortion. The so-called hero who had promised to find the boys' killers was himself a criminal. He was convicted and sent to prison. For Linda Ives, the revelation was devastating. Not only had Harmon failed her family, he had used their pain as cover for his own corruption. Imagine the heartbreak. For years, Kevin and Don's families had trusted Harmon. They had stood beside him, believing he was their ally. But the truth was far worse than silence. The man who promised them justice had been part of the very darkness they were fighting against. Linda later said, "We thought he was our friend. But he was their friend. He was on their side all along." Harmon's downfall proved what many already feared. The Boys on the Tracks case was never about two kids in a train. It was about a whole system poisoned by greed, drugs, and corruption. And Harmon was just one of many players. If even the good guys were secretly corrupt, who could the families trust? And with Harmon gone, would the case finally move forward? Or had the last chance for truth been buried with him? The story of the boys on the tracks wasn't over. But every step forward seemed to reveal only deeper. The trail by the early 1990s, Kevin Ives and Don Henry's case had become more than a tragedy. It was a story tangled in drugs, politics, and betrayal. The boys were gone. Witnesses were dead. The prosecutor was corrupt, but two people refused to give up: their parents. For Linda Ives and Curtis Henry, the pain of losing their sons never faded, but grief had turned into fuel. They couldn't bring Kevin and Don back, but they could fight to make sure the world knew what had been done to them. As Linda once said, "If I sit down and stop, then they win. And I will never let them win." When local officials failed them, the families went to the press. Newspapers began covering the bizarre twists. Two healthy boys, killed on the tracks, autopsies. That didn't match, witnesses dying one after another. A prosecutor who turned out to be a criminal. National outlets started to take notice. Television programs like Unsolved Mysteries and 2020ths aired segments about the case, shocking viewers across America. For the first time, the story of Kevin and Don wasn't confined to Arkansas. It was being told in living rooms from coast to coast. Linda and Curtis even carried their fight all the way to Washington, D.C. They met with federal officials, demanding the Department of Justice investigate. In meetings, Linda laid out the evidence: the autopsy contradictions, the silenced witnesses, the trail of corruption. She looked senators and congressmen in the eye and told them, "My son was murdered." And Arkansas covered it up. Some listened. Some nodded with sympathy. But still, real justice never came. Over the years, the families connected with independent journalists, retired police officers, and even FBI agents who quietly helped. Each one confirmed what Linda already knew: the boys had been murdered. The cover-up was real, but none of them could break through the wall of power protecting those responsible. Linda became known as the mother who would never stop fighting. She kept files stacked floor to ceiling in her home, every article, every police report, every photograph. For decades, she carried her son's case like a torch, refusing to let the world forget. And people admired her courage. Even strangers wrote letters saying, "You don't know me, but I believe you. Keep going, don't stop." By the mid-1990s, the boys on the tracks had become more than a local crime story. It was a national symbol of how corruption could destroy justice. Two small-town boys had become the center of a mystery that reached into politics, drugs, and power. And through it all, their parents refused to be silenced. Would the national spotlight finally bring justice? Or would the powerful forces behind the murders simply wait for the cameras to turn away? For Linda Ives, the fight was far from over, and the next chapter of the Boys on the Tracks case would bring both heartbreak and shocking revelations. By the time the 1990s arrived, the story of Kevin Ives and Don Henry had already shaken Arkansas to its core. Two boys murdered, autopsies falsified, witnesses dead, a prosecutor exposed as corrupt. But the story wasn't finished. In fact, the 1990s would bring new evidence, new theories, and even more bloodshed. With the rise of new forensic techniques, Linda Ives hoped that fresh evidence might finally expose the killers. Independent experts re-examined photographs, clothing, and remaining case files. Some reported signs of gunshot wounds, suggesting the boys may have been shot before being placed on the tracks. Others pointed to inconsistencies in the way Evidence had been handled, gaps in the chain of custody. Missing items, files that mysteriously vanished. It all hinted at one thing. The truth was still being hidden. And then the deaths continued. Throughout the 1990s, at least half a dozen more people connected to the case died. Suspiciously, one man who claimed he knew where the drugs were being dropped was shot execution style. Another, who had once spoken to police, accidentally overdosed. A young woman who had information about local officials was found dead, under bizarre circumstances. Each new death deepened the sense of fear. People in Arkansas whispered that the Boys on the Tracks case was cursed. But Linda and Curtis knew it wasn't a curse. It was a cover-up. A few brave investigators began speaking publicly. They said the case pointed to drug smuggling operations, connected to local law enforcement and even higher political offices. Some linked it to Mena, Arkansas, a town known in the 1980s as a hub for drug-running flights. If Kevin and Don had stumbled upon a drop site, it meant their killers were not just criminals in the woods. They were part of a network reaching deep into the state's most powerful circles. As more pieces came together, theories multiplied. The drug drop theory. The boys saw a cocaine shipment and were silenced. The police connection. Local law enforcement officers were directly involved. The political angle. The case was buried to protect powerful figures in Arkansas's politics. Each theory had evidence behind it, and each made the family's nightmare even darker. For Linda Ives, the 1990s were a decade of endless frustration. She had proof her son was murdered. She had proof of corruption. She had national media attention. And still, the case never moved forward. It was like running into a brick wall, over and over again. But Linda refused to stop. She once said, "I promised Kevin I would never give up. And I never will, not until I die." By the late 1990s, the Boys on the Tracks case had become one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries. But who killed Kevin and Don? Who ordered the cover-up? And how many more people would have to die before the truth was finally revealed? The answers remained elusive, but the fight for justice was far from over. By the time the new millennium arrived, more than a decade had passed since Kevin and Don were killed. For many in Arkansas, the case had faded into rumor, a dark story whispered in hushed tones, but rarely spoken aloud. But for Linda Ives, time did not heal. Every day without justice was another wound. And in the 2000s, she refused to let her son's story die. In the early 2000s, true crime programs and documentaries began revisiting the case. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries re-aired segments, sparking fresh interest. Books were written, journalists re-examined the evidence, and online forums buzzed with speculation. The Boys on the Tracks were no longer just a local tragedy. They had become a symbol of unsolved American mysteries, and Linda Ives made sure to be at the center of it, speaking wherever she was invited, never letting people forget. For a moment, hope flickered again. Rumors swirled that federal agencies were quietly looking at the case. The drug trade of the 1980s. The corruption in Arkansas, the deaths of witnesses, all of it pointed to something far bigger than two teenagers on a railroad track. But just like before, promises of new investigations seemed to stall. Reports would begin, then vanish. Files would open, then close without explanation. The wall of silence still stood. By this point, Linda Ives had become more than just a grieving mother. She was her own investigator. Her home was stacked with boxes of evidence, autopsy reports, photographs, news. clippings, timelines, and witness statements. She could recite every detail, every inconsistency, every name that had crossed her path in the decades-long search. Journalists who visited her called her a walking archive of the boys on the tracks. Case. She carried not only her pain, but the truth, piece by piece, page by page. The years weighed heavily. Curtis, Henry, Don's father, struggled with the pain until his death. For him, the fight ended in sorrow, but Linda carried on speaking. For both families now, she often said, they didn't just kill Kevin and Don, they killed part of us too. But I will not let them erase the boys' story. By the late 2000s, Linda Ives was known across the country, not as a politician, not as a lawyer, but as something far stronger, a mother who refused to stop fighting. Her courage inspired others. Parents of missing and murdered children saw in her a symbol of persistence, but behind her strength was still a heartbreaking truth. She had no justice. Would the new century finally bring answers? Or would Kevin and Don's story remain trapped in the same cycle of corruption, silence, and heartbreak? As the years marched forward, one thing was certain. Linda Ives would never stop. And the boys on the tracks case refused to die. It has been decades since that August night in 1987. Decades since two teenage boys, Kevin Ives and Don Henry, walked into the woods and never came home. Their story has been told in whispers, in news headlines, in courtrooms, and on television screens. But even now, it remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Linda Ives spent her life fighting for Kevin. Through false autopsies, corrupt officials, dead witnesses, and decades of frustration, she never once backed down. She kept her promise to her son, I will never stop. Even when others told her to let it go. Even when the threats came. Even when the years stretched on without answers. Her fight became her life's mission. And yet, to this day, the case remains officially unsolved. No one has ever been convicted of Kevin and Don's murders. No one has ever been held accountable for the cover-up. The families were left with grief, but not with justice. And that is the deepest wound of all. The Boys on the Tracks case is no longer just about two kids in Arkansas. It has become a symbol, a warning of how corruption can infect a system, how the powerful can bury the truth, and how ordinary families are left to fight battles they should never have to fight. To this day, people point to Kevin and Don's story as proof that sometimes the justice system does not protect the innocent. Sometimes it protects itself. What really happened that night? Did Kevin and Don stumble onto a drug drop in the woods? Were they killed by law enforcement officers protecting the trade? Did politics at the highest levels play a role in the cover-up? The evidence points in many directions, but the answers remain buried. For Linda Ives, the fight lasted her entire life. She passed away in 2019, still without justice for Kevin. Her death was another heartbreak, but also a reminder of her incredible strength. She never gave up. She carried the truth as far as she could, and she left behind a legacy of courage. At the heart of it all are two boys. Kevin, 17 years old, a kind, funny teenager with a bright future. Don, 16 years old, full of life, adventurous, loyal to his best friend. They were not criminals. They were not part of the drug world. They were just kids in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and their lives were stolen. The Boys on the Tracks case remains one of the darkest, most tragic stories in American history. It is about murder. It is about conspiracy. But above all, It is about love, the love of parents who refuse to let the world forget their sons. The love of a mother who carried her fight to the very end. And the haunting truth that sometimes justice never comes. As you sit with this story, ask yourself, what would you do if it were your child? How far would you go for the truth? For Kevin and Don, their families went to the ends of the earth, and though the case remains unsolved, their fight ensures that Kevin and Don will never, ever be forgotten.